creating a fairer, more just world. And I'm really excited about this particular conversation. It's the kind of conversation I wish we'd had at this particular stage of my theater making career. And it explores what best practice means in theater making processes, talks of performance ethics, of inclusivity, of the complexities of representation, what it means to be an ally, and all the ways of incorporating best practice into our rehearsal rooms. And really, I think I really began to think about this at the Royal Conservatoire of Scotland in Glasgow, where Mark is the head of department of the MA in Classical and Contemporary Text, Acting and Directing. And I was studying there from 2018 to 2019. And that's really where it began for me, this preoccupation with best practice. Mark is the head of department, like I said. He is a director, a pedagogue, a practice-led researcher, a fight choreographer, and much more. His bio is in the chat box. And we also have Satvika, who will be contextualizing what best practice means for the Indian context. I think most of you probably know her, but she is an independent producer and stage and production manager. And we are so thrilled to have you with us, Satvika. Thank you so much. So what we'll do is we'll start with Mark talking us through best practice and what it means in his context and what representation and allyship has meant for him and his work. And then we will move on to Satvika, and we welcome your questions the entire time, and we'll get started. Is that okay, Mark?
Sounds good.
Okay, brilliant. So Mark, I'd never heard the phrase best practice before I'd come to Scotland. What in your practice as a teacher and as a director has best practice meant for you?
Well, I think in some ways, oh my God, there's my face giant on the screen. I'll have to get used to that. In some ways, I think best practice is a phrase. I think one of my students called a different phrase, but I think it's appropriate here, a mushy P word, in that it seems to say a lot, but it also doesn't really say much of anything at all. I think what it actually does, though, is it asks us to think not about what we ultimately end up making, not about what the outcome of something is, but about the process by which we arrived at it. You will all know that there can be very good pieces of work that have made that emerge that were made under horrific conditions that should never have been allowed to happen. There are also horrible pieces of work that were made under the best conditions. Best practice asks us, instead of um, looking at what was the result, how did the piece of work ultimately function, it looks at how did we get there. What it allows us to do, number one, is to ask important questions about what matters to us. Not necessarily, though certainly it can include questions of artistry, creativity, and things like that, but also questions of process. What do we think it should be like? It also lets us, really, it's important for when things go wrong. Because when something does go wrong, it gives us a chance to look back and say, okay, so in the process, what led to that? Because no matter how much best practice we use, things will inevitably go wrong. So in a sense, best practice it's a shifting concept. It's what a group of people think is the best way to approach something at that moment. And it evolves constantly based on that continual reflection. But I think ultimately it's a process-led way of thinking rather than a product-led way of thinking.
Got it. And what are some examples of the best ways you've seen of the creation of a safe space in a rehearsal room?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is um, I'm grappling with the phrase safe space, and it's something that I come back to quite a lot because um, I think safety. What we mean by safe space is actually, I think, more what we mean by protected space. Um, to me, the idea of a safe space can, if misunderstood, suggest that we should always feel safe and comfortable in the space we're working in. But of course, if we're making art, that's not part of the practice of making art. We might very well choose to go places that are uncomfortable or that make us feel vulnerable or that might make us feel exposed. The responsibility isn't about avoiding those situations, it's about creating a structure that supports those situations. So I find myself more and more adopting the phrase protected space rather than safe space, because the idea is the room we're working in, wherever that is, should protect the people in it to be vulnerable, to be open, to make mistakes, to get things wrong, to for all those things, to allow the journey through what could feel like a dangerous and challenging process to happen, but in a way that then allows us to leave that room and not be marked or scarred by that process. I think it starts, in all honesty, with not separating out notions of protection or allyship, um, or what we're talking about, best practice, from the creative endeavor itself. I think that's something that we get wrong a lot, is we think that questions of, say, accessibility or allyship or representation are in somehow in addition to the process of making the work. And as soon as you make it something that's in addition to, it becomes something that feels optional or feels like it's a nice to have, not a need to have. And so the first step we need to take is actually to say, no, these are essential, fundamental things that belong as part of the creative journey we're going on, not something else, or not something that is extra. Sorry, I had what I'm sure was going to be an amazing sentence to follow it up with, and it's just flown right out of my head. Um, it starts with this idea of this is intrinsic to the work that we do. And if I think about the work that we do in theater, we may make theater, we may make performance for any number of reasons. One of the best definitions that I've ever heard, though, came from a teacher I had about 20 years ago, who said the process of making theater, or the act of making theater, is the act of making people feel more human, um, which I quite like because it doesn't suggest a particular type of theater. It just suggests an experience of shared humanity. Now, what's ironic, though, is that so often when we're in the stress of making theater, we stop treating each other like human beings in the process of doing the work. Um, and so I think, again, if we are setting out to make people feel more human, then we actually need to start that in terms of how we deal with each other. Um, it involves a few different things. It involves listening more than anything else, and listening not just to what people say, but to what's being implied or unsaid in the space. Um, it involves humility, recognizing that no one in that room has all the answers or has the authority or ability to dictate exactly what uh, may be the strongest version of the work that's being made. It involves compassion. It involves recognizing that people in the room are human beings. It involves recognizing our own position in the world, and how we can't necessarily leave that position in the world at the door. We talked about best practice. I think 5 years ago, even, someone would have said that best practice is you leave everything outside of the rehearsal room, and come in like a blank slate, and focus only on the work. I would argue now that's not best practice, because the people who come into that space, I'll put it like this: someone said this, I can't leave my body outside the rehearsal room. And we live in a time where simply being in the world can become politicized, whether that's through systemic racism, unconscious bias, all kinds of inequities that are running rife through everything. And to suggest to somebody that they should leave all of that outside the room in order to help everybody get on with the work is frankly irresponsible, and actually places the burden for a smooth rehearsal process on the people who are already carrying the largest burden outside of it. So there has to be a recognition that people are coming in as human beings in a space who may be who are dealing with a whole lifetime of experience. More basically, there's a wonderful quote from a book called Notes on Directing, which is advice for directors that says, operate as if everybody is working in a state of near catatonic terror at all times and behave accordingly. It's scary being in a rehearsal room making work. And it doesn't do anybody any favors if you act like a jerk. It just makes it a little bit scarier. Um, so it starts there. And it also starts with the willingness to have difficult conversations, with the willingness and ability to create a space where people can be called out and where people can be called in, and where when that happens, it is seen for what it actually is, which is an act of generosity on the part of the person doing the calling out, because it is an effort to help us all to be a bit better. Um, Again, the big thing is so often these practices that seem neutral are actually a way of reinforcing existing power dynamics and placing the burden for sustaining them on exactly the wrong people. And so we have to start by recognizing that we're not in a neutral space. We're not in a space devoid of hierarchies, devoid of inequities or anything like that. And then take active action to try to remedy that.
We speak of vulnerability, and I'm thinking about your practice and the process that you have created, which you call performance of the unconscious. Um, and I have, and you always see directing not so much as directing, but as coaching, also as a way of perhaps situating yourself in the room and addressing these hierarchies. Could you talk us through that a little bit?
So yes, I don't know if I'll go through all the details of performance in the unconscious, but I think I'll hit the sort of the key point here. Um, and this is now I am going to go into a bit of creative practice, but again, I think this is how this will hopefully be useful in terms of how creative practice and questions about inclusion and equity and creating the type of space we want can actually go hand in hand. I'm a huge advocate for something that Eugenio Barba has put out, and I tend to think of a sort of modified version of a concept that Barba offers in everything that I'm doing, whether in teaching or in directing. And I'll give you the sort of Cliff Notes version of it, but basically Barba talks about in any performance there being not one dramaturgy but three that are at play in the space. Um, Basically, one of them is the one we normally associate with dramaturgy. What story are we telling? What is the text saying? All of these things like that. Then you have a dramaturgy that deals with what's happening inside the actors. Um, it's a living or organic dramaturgy that is the actor's experience or the actor's movement through the performance. And then you also have a dramaturgy for the audience, for the spectators. What are they actually receiving from that performance? Now, I like this is because we often, at least in the UK, fall into the trap of saying the text is the most important thing and almost creating a hierarchical relationship where the text is most important and actors and directors are interpreting that text and serving that text. But if you look at Barba's model, it actually doesn't have to be hierarchical. It just says these three things are going on in the space. Notice none of them involve a director. It involves the playwright, the writer, and the audience. The director's job becomes working out what the relationship between those things might be on the project. So, in a sense, Tanvi, when you're talking about the coaching model or performance in the unconscious, what we're talking about is actually creating a space where we can actually explore the organic dramaturgy that's going on. We can explore and give the actors space to find how they live or experience or work their way through the performance situation, which may or may not match up with the text. The very common thing that you'll hear when you get to those tensions are things like, my character wouldn't say that. Where the actor's experience tells them that actually what the text is saying somehow feels inauthentic or doesn't connect with them. Now, in a hierarchical process that puts the text at the top, you basically would offer a response saying, but your character does say that. It says so right in the script. So say it. Whereas when you're dealing with these three dramaturgies, you can actually allow for the exploration of how does this actor or these actors meet this material on which we're working. It becomes about encounter rather than interpretation. And it allows us to meet these things on an equal footing. At the end of the day, the director will still negotiate and say, well, yeah, I understand we've explored it, but you still have to say that line. So let's figure out how to make that work. Or it might be that something else happens. But I think there's a danger, particularly for directors, to see actors like sort of paint on a palette as a tool or as an object through which they can achieve their vision. And first of all, how boring. I already know what my vision is. If I just wanted to see that, I wouldn't need to rehearse a play for 4 weeks. Um, but second of all, how inhuman to to objectify someone in that way. I'm much more interested in seeing what a group of talented, interesting actors find as a reflection of their own experience, their own ways of being in the world. And then after we found what that is, bringing that into dialogue with, okay, the text is saying this, or okay, we're trying to tell this story to the audience. So how do we do that? So for me, it's very much a process of starting with the people in the room and then working and shaping or creating a structure that supports what's happening in the room and that establishes a relationship between the text, the audience, and the actors, um, that leads to something exciting, um, and hopefully something I never would have imagined at the outset. Because the last thing I want to do is spend 4 weeks doing what I already know.
I remember I had the fortune of being in your rehearsal room with The Witch of Edmonton in the Renaissance text phase. And you showed me your storyboard for the entire play, and especially for the initial bit. And you never showed it to the actors, and you never sought to impose it or even suggest it. But you knew what the play would look like in your head, the entire thing. How do you arrive at a point where you can make actors feel like they're on the same page with each other and with yourself and your vision without sort of imposing an external idea on them, and without it making it feel like it comes from a certain authority, a teacher, a director?
Well, I think the first thing is the power of admitting, the power of saying, I don't know, is I think one of the best things that we can do. Now, you mentioned that storyboard, and this is something I do for myself to prepare, is I will usually write up, it's usually around 10 to 15,000 words where I write through what I think the play is and how I think the play works. But as soon as I've written it, I don't ever look at it again. So not only the actors never see it, I never referred to it, I never actually looked at it again. I still haven't looked at it. I have it, but I've not looked at it. Um, Now, I'll give you an example though of I think a case where something that sort of creates that space. So I work. This was a The Witch of Edmonton is a play by Decker, Ford, and Rowley, and I adapted it really heavily. And it took me about a year to create the adaptation, and I probably read the play about 80 to 100 times before the first rehearsal. Now, in the first week, one of the actors recognized that there was a problem with one of the early scenes. You'll remember it was the transition with Old Carter and Widow Thorny, um, early in the play. And basically, he said, yeah, this doesn't work. And I looked at it, and of course, once we were on his feet, of course it didn't work. I spent a year and never realized it didn't work. Immediately, then, my answer is, okay, wow, you're right. That really doesn't work. Um, we need to shift what we've done here. Let me take a look at it. Or actually, I think I even said to this actor, do you have an idea of how we might reorganize this? And I think the four actors and I essentially rewrote that scene, or revised that scene, recut that scene in a way that worked. But actually, ultimately, it was those actors who solved the problem, not me. I just get to take credit for it because then it works because I'm the one who gets credited as director. But as soon as I've said, I don't know, you're right, that doesn't work, what can we do? Suddenly I'm no longer trying to assume this position of authority or hierarchy or I know and I'm going to tell you what to do and you do it. In a sense, we're all from different perspectives exploring. I think in a way, I'll use a metaphor for this one. The danger of being a director is going in thinking you've got a map with a route and an X at the end that tells you where you're trying to go. And I think if you do that, then you are imposing something on a room of people and you are shutting down possibilities. What I think a director needs to do is come in with a compass bearing. I know what direction we're going to walk in, but I have no idea what we're going to find when we walk in that direction. And we may end up coming to a massive river and have to change direction for a while and go somewhere else. Or we may decide, actually, this is the wrong direction. Let's go. Um, so it becomes about that. It becomes about recognizing that all the work we do as directors particularly isn't what we do in the rehearsal room. It's what gives us permission to be in the rehearsal room. Um, and then we forget all of that because we've done the work and then we can actually deal with what's happening right now. And I think in my experience with actors and as an actor, because before I was a director, as I was an actor, as soon as I feel like a director is dealing with what's happening right now, with what we're finding right now, with what I'm discovering, with what other people are discovering, is making space for that, is encouraging it, is excited by that, suddenly I feel much safer to make more offers. Um, and I feel much safer to offer things. That doesn't mean that everything an actor offers, I'm going to say yes to. Tanvi will tell you I said no to a lot of things at various points, but it does mean it's always going to get tried. And if we're going to say no, we're going to make sure that no is the right answer. Because also, I don't know if you know this, Tanvi, there are several things that I said yes to that I was certain I would have said no to before we tried them.
One of the most fascinating discoveries for me during the process of The Witch of Edmonton was the intimacy and the fight call. I'd never seen them before, and I'd never seen such systematic ways of thinking about and executing intimacy and fight choreography. So first, could you tell us what they entail, and then tell us how you think through them and then execute them?
Yes, now I should say at the outset, it's worth noting, I don't want to set myself up as somebody who always knows what to do and always gets everything right. Because actually, one of the things that the actors fed back to on Witch of Edmonton is they wish we had an intimacy choreographer. We didn't have one on Witch of Edmonton, and we probably should have, to be honest. But we didn't, so we got that one wrong. Next time I do a show that has that level of intimacy, I will certainly have an intimacy choreographer working on it. Um, but I am a fight director, and I think they operate on largely the same principles. Um, essentially, what
Could you actually explain to us what they mean? Because I don't
sure.
think most of us have worked with intimacy and fight choreographers in India.
So essentially, a fight choreographer, whenever there's violence that is happening on stage within the fictional world of the play, the fight choreographer is the person who actually choreographs who actually creates the choreography that the actors execute. Um, Usually it's designed to look realistic, so it's not stylized, it isn't stylized in any way, though it might be stylized. That's a role that's existed in the UK and in the US for decades. Intimacy choreography is a much newer concept that's just now really becoming what would be considered best practice in the UK. Essentially, it's a similar idea. If you're doing an intimate scene, a scene of a sexual nature, let's say, um, it suggests that actually nothing should be left to chance, and there should be somebody outside of that scene whose job it is to actually choreograph exactly what's happening and when. That actors then execute that choreography and and act it. Um, so that's fundamentally what these roles are. Now, the process is actually, in a lot of respects, not different, I would imagine, than other choreography. You might know exactly what you're going to choreograph at the outset and teach that choreography, or you might explore and find that choreography in the space with the actors, depending on the actors, depending on how people want to work. But what you're doing, particularly, I'll start with intimacy and then go to fight choreography. For intimacy, what you're doing is you're removing any ambiguity about the situation. You know, if someone is being, if someone is being touched or if someone's being kissed or things like that, essentially what it means is that everybody, the actors, the director, the stage manager, knows exactly what is meant to happen in those moments. And it's been agreed, it's been rehearsed, it's been choreographed. So what that means is there isn't a question about are boundaries being violated, or is there some sort of blending here between what an actor is doing to another actor and what a character is doing to another character? It's choreography. It is mechanically rehearsed, mechanically learned, and then is executed with acting on top of it. And that's just to make sure that everybody is safe, that no one's taken advantage of. And also, it allows for actors to assert their boundaries within scenes of an intimate nature. Um, every actor is different, and every actor is going to have a point at which they're comfortable in the right circumstances exploring intimacy on stage or on film. And there'll also a point beyond which they don't want to go. And that is absolutely valid. Um, when you're choreographing, it allows the actor to say, okay, yes, I'm okay with this, but I don't want to go beyond this point. You know, yes, I'll do this, but I don't want to be nude. for example. And then the choreographer can take those boundaries into account and can choreograph something that is telling the story in a rich and interesting way, but something that everyone has agreed to and is operating within a very strict set of boundaries. Fight choreography is similar in that we're dealing with simulating violence uh, in order to make sure that the actors are safe while the characters maybe appear to be in danger. And again, it's systematic. It's all right, I'm going to punch you like this in this moment, and this is how it's going to work. And we're going to learn it slowly, and we're going to become muscle memory, and then we're going to put the acting on top of it. So at a basic level, it's about health and safety. The other thing it does, though, again, coming back to health and safety isn't a bonus, it's intrinsic. It makes those moments better. And I'll give you an example of that. If one character has to slap another on stage, often I see directors who just say, oh, just slap him lightly. But you end up with a really lousy looking slap at that point because it's just like a little tap because no one really wants to wind up and hit someone full on. Whereas if you choreograph it with fight choreography, you can wind up and you can really go for it. It's the same thing, I think, with intimacy choreography. You know, if you know exactly what's going on, you know, any moan, any vocalization, any action is part of the choreography, which means that you can actually commit to it fully, knowing that it's been agreed. It's also for the people doing it. You know, if you imagine yourself in the situation where you are the one who is, say, engaging in intimacy, and your character is meant to enjoy it. If it's been staged and agreed, you can really play the enjoyment of it. If it's been left to chance and you're playing the enjoyment of it, suddenly it feels very awkward because do you think I'm enjoying it as the actor? Or do you think I'm enjoying it as the character, or what that line is? So essentially, these things allow for um, much more committed performances because everybody knows what's happening. Everybody can go much further with the acting of them, and that just makes them, frankly, better. The process is mechanical. It's you start out, you choreograph it, you work your way through it, you do it really slowly. You do it really slowly every day for a little bit of time until you build muscle memory. You revise it, you bring it up to speed, so that by the time you get to performance, everybody is just it just happens. You don't need to be thinking through what do I do next. It is learned choreography that is then executed with the acting being part of that choreography.
May I say something? Just
Yeah, of
apart
course.
from responses. I think, I mean, this is such an important point because we hear endless stories of people who say that they got lost in the moment and they got caught up in the moment, and they gave their all to the role, and as a result of it they ended up doing something spontaneously and hurting somebody. And whether the hurt is physical in terms of violence, or whether it is in an intimate scene, they ended up doing something because they were in the moment. And unfortunately that has gotten so glorified over time, this thing of I am the kind of actor that loses himself or herself on stage, and I'm the character, I'm not the actor anymore. And at some level I think that is such bullshit, because we have to, I mean, simulation is such an important word in what you just said. If you are creating something, then you're creating the impact of something. You're not actually living through that experience. You're creating the effect that you're living through that experience. And it's so important as students and as people who are just starting out to keep these things in mind, because so often these things get sensationalized, glorified, uh, and then you're suddenly looking up to things that are really wrong to do in the rehearsal space. And I mean, I myself have friends, and I'm sure these students have friends as well who've heard these kind of nightmarish stories of rehearsal rooms where, whether it is intimate scenes or it is physically, violent actions, and there have been directors who said, "Go for it, like surprise the person. I want there to be a spontaneous reaction. So surprise her with an actual slap in the show." And I think that it's so nightmarish to think about it, but it's done much more commonly than we know. So I think it's a really important point to think about at this stage for everybody here.
It's inexcusable, frankly. Um, you know, actors are professionals. Someone saying, I get lost in the moment and I might improvise something new. That's not art. That's not uh that's not something to be glorified. That's inexcusable behavior. That is unprofessional behavior. And anybody who thinks that that's how acting works doesn't understand acting. Full stop. Because I don't care, because let's be honest here, the idea I am the character, that's not acting, that's a psychotic break. If you actually believe you are someone else in a fictional circumstance, that's not acting. It doesn't mean we aren't trying to imagine what it might be like. It doesn't mean we aren't trying to explore what our organic response to a situation is. Of course we are, that's part of the job. But seriously, the boundaries, people. um, it's about boundaries. It's also recognizing that the surprise of that an actor feels when they are unexpectedly slapped will not read like the surprise a character might feel while being slapped. It just won't. So not only is it is it a horribly unprofessional thing to do, it's not even achieving what you want to achieve because it's not telling the right story. As a fight choreographer, I can tell you the fastest way to make an audience check out and not invest in the story is if they think the actors are in danger. Fight choreography only works when we believe the actors are completely safe and the characters are in danger. And that distinction is absolutely vital. And I think it's the same in intimacy choreography. You know, if I'm watching a show, you can tell when it's the characters who are doing it, and you can tell when you're not sure. And when you're not sure, I get very uncomfortable because at that point I start to feel like, okay, I don't know what's going on here, and I don't know if this is real or not. And if this is real, have I just stumbled into some sort of softcore pornographic play that I didn't know about? Um, that distinction of actor and character is vital. You know, Mike Alfred says theater is about one group of people pretending to be a second group of people in front of a third group of people. And that's actually really important. And that's part of the contract we have with an audience is, yes, we're going to go places that might be disturbing or dangerous or uncomfortable or things like that. But we're all frankly just playing a game of believe. We're all sharing in a game of make believe, and that's what protects us in the room. That's the protected space for the audience to know I can go into this because Hamlet's not actually going to die. So I can get fully invested in will he die because I know on some level it's safe. If I think for a second that Hamlet might actually die, I'm not going to stay in my seat. Or I'm going to be sitting the whole thing watching like this, just worrying about the poor actor. Um, so yeah, again, best practice. The work is worse, it's less effective, and it's frankly inhumane to do that to another actor. And I would say if a director ever says, "Oh, just slap the person," at least in the UK, my advice is always, equity will tell you, "No, that's not okay." You are fully within your right to say, "No, that's not okay." And if anybody tries to pressure you or penalize you for it, equity, the actors union, will step in and say, "This is not okay." I don't know if that's similar in the Indian context, but certainly, but if it's not, it should be. Frankly, that should just be the standard everywhere.
We don't have
Um,
this. Also, we have a lot of legends of older directors and all these like legends that have been passed on over the years about what a tyrant a particular director was in a room and how he hurled abuses and threw chappals or bottles at people and banged his own head against the wall when things didn't work out. And it's told with such reverence, like these stories. And while I guess they didn't know any better and they were who they were and they were doing the things they thought were okay to do at the time, but I feel like now everything has changed so much. We really need to be thinking about this whole hierarchical structure of the rehearsal space and the setting of those rules. So could you say something, tell us something about how you set the rules of a rehearsal space when you're about to begin, when it's the first time everybody's come into that space? Does the team do it together? Do you have certain things in mind? Do you guys together answer certain questions for the group? How do you go about that?
well, what I tend to do, and I think Tom, you'll probably remember this from Witch of Edmonton, is I will tend to start. The whole team will be in the first rehearsal. So designers, actors, stage management, everybody's in that room for the first rehearsal. What I won't do is give a big long speech about what I think the play is or anything like that, or trying to illustrate this is what we're going to do together. In fact, Tom, if you remember what I did on the first day of Witch of Edmonton, is I said, all right, everyone, here's what we're going to do. We're going to imagine it's opening night and you have to perform the whole show. Off you go. So before I've even made a directorial offer, I've essentially said, we're just playing, but get on your feet with your script in hand and work your way through the show. See what you find, have a play with it. Now, the intention there is both because I get really bored of read-throughs. So that's just me not liking read-throughs all that much. But it's also, again, immediately then, I think that establishes something right at the outset, that this is not, you are here to execute my vision. It's, I am here to facilitate a process for a shared vision to come through. And I think actually, for as much as we can say this is what we're doing, it's what we do that actually communicates that. It's why, again, the second I say I don't know, that means more than whatever words I could make. I think it's at this point, at least at RCS, that I should mention we have what's called a performance ethics policy. Now, this is somewhat unique among drama schools pretty much all over the world. I don't think many have a performance ethics policy, and most of them are not very good because most of them are just a list of things you can't do. What RCS tried to do was something a little bit different, and the man who wrote it basically said to me in talking about it that his approach was, if you can get the thinking right, you don't need a list of do's and don'ts because you'll have a process by which you can figure out what the right thing to do is. But it's all rooted in the idea of informed consent, which is a research concept. And it's actually the director of research who wrote the performance ethics policy. Basically, it says that anybody who's engaging with the performance, actors, audience, designers, crew, any director, everybody, has the right to know what they're getting into before they start and to consent or withhold consent at being involved. So in a sense, what that means in practice is that before we even step in the room, everybody involved needs to know what parameters we're working under and needs to be able to have the necessary conversations about that. So for Witch of Edmonton, I made sure weeks before even auditions were held, everybody auditioning for that show knew that there was going to be an exploration of sexuality. I was also clear that wouldn't involve any nudity, but that it would involve physical intimacy and it would involve going into that territory emotionally, particularly when it comes to questions of sexual violence. I also made it clear which roles might be most impacted by that, and invited everybody auditioning to essentially say, I don't think I can play this role or be in this show because I don't think I'm in a place where I can engage with those things. In a sense, there's a disclosure that happens that then that means everybody knows what they're in for. Now that might change over the course of the rehearsal process, but if I suddenly decide, actually, I do want nudity in this moment, we've already established that wasn't the case when we started. So it's got to be something that's done with consent. The other part of the process that protects the actors and prevents the hierarchy is that our policy says that consent can be revoked at any time, which is true of anything that involves consent, meaning that if I've not been clear to everybody what they're in for, we could get to a week before opening and my lead actor could say, I'm revoking my consent, I'm not going to do the show. And that would be okay according to the policy. So it places the burden on me because as much as I don't like hierarchies, there's a certain amount of hierarchy that's inescapable in a rehearsal room because as director, at the end of the day, I'm the one who says yes or no to a choice. But I've got to be really careful with that because if I'm not clear and if I'm not creating a space that feels protected and supported, I might very well lose the actor. But I think there's a huge difference between knowing on this day I'm going to come in and we're going to be staging a scene that involves sexual violence and being able to prepare myself for that as an actor, to have had the discussions about what that means, to know who's going to be in the room, how we're going to work. That becomes a workable model as opposed to, okay, today we're going to explore this scene and or even having to talk about it in the moment. Because actually talking about it in the moment isn't sufficient because it's coercive because suddenly we're on rehearsal time. So the more time we spend talking through, the more pressure is on everybody to just get on with it. So those conversations have to happen outside and before rehearsal so that people have proper time to think through it, to sit with it, to say, okay, that's what I'm going to be asked to do. Do I feel okay about it? Do I feel okay with this, with these other people? What do I need in order to go there if I am going to go there? And can I have that conversation? I'm thinking, for example, I had the conversation with one of the actors who was exploring sexual violence the most. And I basically had to say, and I basically said to her, I can see you're really, really diving into this. I can see that, and I know that you're doing that. What I need to know is, number one, are you feeling okay doing that? And number two, what can I do when we finish working on a scene to help support you in that process? Um, so she then said to me, yes, I'm happy with it. What I might need is I might just need to be able to be there and be quiet and gather myself. I might need 2 minutes to do that, where we don't move on, where we just wait. Um, and I said, that's how you can help me, is basically by holding the space while I collect myself at the end of it. So that's what I did. And Tom, you'll remember there were moments where we would sit for 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes in silence until that actor said, okay, I'm ready to move on now. So again, it's that question of me going to you and saying, I know this is a big ask. I know I'm asking a lot of you to go to this place, to do this material. So what can I do to make it easier for you, to make it safer for you, to make it something that feels more positive for you? And again, it's in a lot of ways, it's humility. In the West, in the UK, in the US, and in Europe, the whole concept of a director is only about 170 years old. Whereas the concept of an actor is thousands of years old. And I do remember an actor friend of mine who once said, tongue in cheek, your profession's been around for 170 years. Mine's been around for 2,000 years. Your job is to get out of my way. But there's something to that actually in that model I talked about, there's the actor, there's the text, there's the audience. The director is nowhere in those three dramaturgies. So what gives me the right to try to assert a domination over them? That's actually not my thing. And at the end of the day, I have no control over what goes up on that stage other than the goodwill of the people who I'm working with to do what we've agreed on. But fundamentally, once the show opens, I have no control over what happens. So it's in my best interest to get everybody on the same page and to get everybody on my side. Otherwise, I'm not going to see the piece that we worked on because they could just do something else.
And Mark, I think what was really interesting, there's a bunch of thoughts and I'm going back to them. You talked about the kind of differentiation between the actor and the character, but I also remember you made a very, very big differentiation between the play and the mood of the play and the mood of the rehearsal room. And The Witch of Edmonton was an extremely heavy play and quite it brought the mood of the room down quite a bit. And so in the breaks, you used to do a lot of things to kind of lighten that, and you call them extremely thought through, calculated conversations where you would not make it that intense. Or when you brought in donuts, I remember the day you brought in donuts and suddenly we were doing an incredibly heavy scene and suddenly the mood kind of changed because you said just because the play is heavy doesn't mean the room has to be. What are the ways of ensuring that the mood of the play doesn't seep into the room, and how do you kind of make that happen?
I think it's a bit about counterbalancing, to be honest. Witch of Edmonton was a very heavy play. So I don't want the mood of the room to be heavy because then we're just all waiting in misery for 4 weeks. So for me, it was very much about trying to keep everything light, trying to keep things a bit jokey. And I think the actors on some level are aware of it because my jokes aren't that good. And that's okay. You'll remember we had a scene in Witch of Edmonton that involved about 5 or 6 actors in effectively what looked like a big, massive orgy. I very deliberately, even though quite a lot of people called it the orgy scene, I very deliberately called it the pwompening. On the onomatopoeic, all the bodies just going to go plump together. Now, I did that not because I think that's the best term for it, but because it's very hard to get lost in the seriousness of that moment when your director's saying, okay, guys, time to do the pwompening. It's a desire to really draw that distinction. Now, if I was doing a slapstick comedy where everything's extraordinarily silly, I would almost certainly have a much more serious rehearsal room, because it's very easy if you're doing something very silly to lose the specificity and lose the rigor of it. So in a sense, for me, it's almost always about, all right, well, what's the atmosphere of the play, and how do we counterbalance that to bring a little bit of evenness to that environment?
Got it. And I'm going to now jump over to Satvika because we've been talking about performance ethics, and I know I found them incredibly daunting when I was at RCS. And I'd never had to take on that kind of responsibility of confidentiality clauses and the triggers of people and people opting out because of certain subject matters and all of that. And um, and it's really interesting because I've worked with Satvika, and she's really, I've seen the kind of rigor and discipline that she's worked with and brought to the rehearsal rooms I've been in. And with hashtag Supernova play we did with Indian Ensemble, I know the kind of the very, very simple ways in which you managed to bring in a certain sort of regularity, a certain sort of professionalism that had nothing to do with keeping people accountable and being personally responsible for anybody, but everybody just collectively taking responsibility for that. And I know that we live in a, as in we work in a kind of a community that overuses the word jugaad. And as two people who are very, very opposed to the idea of jugaad, jugaad means, I'll let Satvika explain it. As people who are not particularly enamored with the idea of jugaad, Satvika, could you talk us through your practice and how you've arrived at it?
I don't know if I can define jugaad. It's a feeling more than, something we do. It's just the way we are. So, I wanted to actually start with the course that I did in the UK, it was a master's in collaborative theatre production and design. And what it really did was bring to the fore this idea of collaboration and equal stakes in the ensemble. Our cohort itself, we didn't have any actors and we didn't have any directors in the cohort. We were 5 people from 5 different countries, and we were a production manager, a stage manager, a lighting and video designer, a set designer, and a tech director. And we came together and we created the art collectively. And what that really did was sort of enforce this idea that every person in the team is important. You have equal stakes in the production, but also equal responsibility, not just for creating the art, but also, like you said, equal responsibility in ensuring that the work that we do is done in the best possible manner, in the safest possible manner. I work as a producer, a production manager, and a stage manager with various companies in India. And I believe that, we can bring about change just as individuals or a collective of individuals, and it doesn't need to be a company that sets the rules, or it doesn't need to be, it doesn't even need to be formal structures that a company has established. Individually, we can make change. So, when I work with a company that doesn't have systems in place, I enforce and establish the best practices at work. I create a space where all the work can flourish. I believe it's important to establish what the rules of the game are before you play it, right? Like every time you start a new board game, you have to know what the rules are. Otherwise, we're on an unequal footing. Everyone's going towards a different end. You're getting there individually in different paths, and lots of people are going to get left behind. So especially when I start work, we establish the rules of the room, of the production, and how things are going to go. Even if we're not meeting together and doing this collectively, there is an email that will go out and say, this is what we're going to be doing. These are the rules that we're going to be following, and we request everyone to abide by them. I also believe that, because I'm in a position of power as in any of these roles, I believe it is my responsibility to speak up for people who are not in that position of power. And often that is the crew. Especially in India, there are a lot of companies and a lot of ensembles where the crew is sort of relegated to just being production. They're just the people who are sent to run errands. They're the people who are making your chai. You're not really thinking members of the team. So it's really important to change that. And me coming in has changed that. Everyone that I work with, I am a creative collaborator, even if I'm only a stage manager or only a production manager. I'm the person helping bring a creative idea to its full realization. And so all the people in the team who are part of the crew are also therefore thinking members of the team. And what that also helps with is sort of democratization of the theater process. We're taking away the so-called, the power that even Ira mentioned of your old school directors who were tyrants and threw bottles at people. You're stripping away some of their power because you're making it a room that has equal stakes. And I just want to say that stage managers do make chai, and we make really good chai, but that's not all we do. There are many more things we do. And I think companies are starting to recognize that in India, but of course we have a long way to go. But with every new company that I work with, I sort of try and fight that little bit of a fight. I also, in this process of, collaboration and democratization, I also ensure that even if there isn't a formal, like formal structures like an ICC that's been established by a theater company, I at least ensure that all the team members know that there are people they can go to. If you're struggling with the work that's happening, if you're struggling with your mental health, if you're struggling with other members in the team, know that there is someone you can go to. And it's not just, one person, because I understand that, you might have a problem with me, or you might not find me to be a comfortable person that you can come to. I know people who worked with me know that, I'm always, really professional and really serious and not very fun. So I know that a lot of people aren't comfortable hanging out with me or sharing their emotions with me, but I always ensure that when I'm working on a show, I have other people that you can go to. And it has happened where I've had other crew members confide in other crew members, or actors who are having trouble go to others, not me, when they've had a problem, and then they've come to me and we've still resolved it with me sort of not going to them directly. So even when you don't have a formal structure, you can do this. Just one. Yes.
Someone just asked what ICC is.
It's an internal complaints committee, which Jehan's already answered.
Got it. And as to people who've kind of studied in the UK and have come back and want to build our practice in India, and know that contextualizing all of these ideas of performance ethics and all that is important, it's very difficult to kind of take what works there and bring it here and use it as is. Can you talk us through some of the ways in which you have adapted some of these and contextualized some of these learnings, or the things that haven't worked for you, perhaps?
Yeah, I mean, one of the big things for me was this idea of health and safety. And I understand what has happened is I understand the importance, and it's given me, it's heightened my awareness. But simple things like, especially when I was at school, because all your school training, especially technical theater training, is all about best practices all the time, right? Like you're creating an ideal production environment and you're following all the rules, because once you go out into the world, you will have to navigate those rules and see what works and what doesn't work. But therefore, while we were at school, we had so many instances where the students, the undergraduate students, because we were on the masters, were so hung up on following things to the T that, there was an instance where we were doing a circus production, which had an acrobat and an aerial artist who was on a harness. So she was flying. She was also wearing heels. And as part of her act, also stood up on a table. And this put the undergrad production manager into a tizzy, because you cannot be wearing heels and standing up on a table. That's not possible. We have to draw up 5 different risk assessments to assess the risk that this one action will have. And I understand that it is risky, and I understand that we need to do this properly. But also we have rehearsed it, keeping those things in mind. And this is a trained professional who will be performing this stunt. It's not me, who's really clumsy and walks into walls, who's going to wear a harness and fly onto a table. This is a person whose job it is to fly, who's going to be doing that. So, finding that balance was something that at school was really hard. And we were always at ends with the rest of the students at school, because we've come from all our varied experiences, and then we're coming into the UK system. But what it has helped me with is understanding, the importance of this risk. And like you mentioned, jugaad, where for us, having a bamboo scaffolding that's tied together with jute rope, and having a guy in rubber flip-flops climbing up onto it with two lights, and then rigging his lights up on this bamboo scaffolding is completely normal. We're just, that's completely fine. But it's not, right? Obviously, there is risk attached to it. So what is the actual risk attached to it, and how can you even make that simpler? And how can you make that safer? Maybe you cannot, bring in actual metallic scaff. Maybe the bamboo is all we have access to. But what can we do? Maybe, we can ensure that everyone's wearing shoes. We can ensure that the area where this person is working is safe and cordoned off, so there's not someone walking back and forth. So that's little things that I have done about ensuring that things are safe. Sorry, you might hear an azan in my background. I apologize. So even on a production, when we did Disney's Aladdin in Bombay, on the first day that the actors showed up, which was obviously still when work was happening on stage, we did a safety briefing with the actors where we told them, this is where you can walk and this is where you cannot walk while the work is still going on. Ensure that you're always wearing shoes, which is, and you need to underline that, especially with dancers, because they're used to walking bare feet. But when you're setting up, you might have nails lying around, you might have people working in a certain area. So we cordoned off those areas, told them where they couldn't go. And we also had, instructions like, whenever we say heads up, bar coming down, everyone knows that you need to stop, you need to look up, because a fly bar with a set piece on it is probably flying onto stage. So everyone knew that instruction. So then whoever shouted that out, people would stop, they would look up, and they would move out of the way. So, you can do simple things like that and establish the rules. And it's not even, about health and safety. It's like you mentioned, things like by generating more paperwork, like we always generate rehearsal reports and show reports. All of those reports will always mention what time everyone showed up. So if someone is consistently being late, your name and how late you were is going to show up on that report, and that report is being circulated with the entire team, right? So you have a collective also sense of responsibility. And your report is also mentioning what every department needs to do, or if things haven't been done, or things that need to be done, achieved from the next rehearsal. So everyone knows what we're doing at all points of time. And you also have this collective responsibility saying, I'm not the only person who has a lot of work to do. Everyone's doing a lot of work, and this is everything that they're doing. So I think that's, that accountability and that transparency is very important. Another thing that I guess we look at is scheduling, but holistically. Scheduling, I think, again, is a really powerful tool. So I try to ensure that I'm more sensitive when I create a schedule, and I'm not looking at it only from the perspective of what the production needs, but also from what the team might need. Are we working too many hours? Are we taking enough breaks? Is everyone on the team, getting enough breaks? Especially on a show like Aladdin, where you can imagine there were at least 50 crew members, I ensured that each one of those people had enough breaks, and we ensured that we cycled through the teams, or we staggered our call times. Often we'll think about what giving the actors enough rest, but we forget about the crew. The crew is working 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. and then you have to travel home. And if you're living in an urban center, you know that traveling home is another hour or 2 hours, and then you have to show up the next morning for a 7 a.m. call. And of course, we understand that that's necessary for a couple of days, but it's not, possible for you to do for extended periods of time. Actors need rest so that they can perform 100%. They can rest their voices, they can rest their bodies, and do a good show. but it's equally important for the crew to do this as well, right? You're operating heavy machinery, you are moving heavy set pieces. These are all dangerous tasks as well. So you can't have someone who's tired and has nodded off while moving a 150 kg flybar prop and has brought it crashing down to the floor because they've not got enough rest. And I think a simple thing like issuing a schedule, which then again goes to everyone. And so everyone knows that this is when this team is coming in. These are the hours that this particular team, like the lighting team, these are the 2 hours where the lighting team will be working. So we need to ensure that we give them time. And then this is the time when the lighting team will walk away because they need their rest. Also establishing, breaks. When are we going to have lunch? And saying that, okay, this is when we would like to have lunch. And we try and, give a break at that point, but sometimes it's not possible, right? You're in the middle of a task. You say, okay, let's just push lunch by 15 minutes. And that was also, a thing that I grappled with some people in the UK, where you would be in the middle of the task and suddenly it's 10:15, like, all right, time for my cup of tea, and you drop what they're doing and walk away for their 10 minutes of tea. This wasn't everyone, but this was a lot of people. And so that extreme sort of brought me to a balance where I used to be the person who would not eat anything through the day. I would just survive on cups of chai, and be like, I don't need a break, I'll be fine. And now I'm the person who goes around and saying, have you had your tea? Have you had your snacks? Have you had your lunch? Ensuring that everyone is, even if you're not getting your 1 hour, at least you're getting your 45 minutes of a break. So those are a couple of things that I have done, and in relation to the work in the UK.
Got it. And finally, we spoke about Muktidham and how you were a tour manager for a play that traveled across Uttar Pradesh. And we speak of representation and what was that experience like for you, and what kind of takeaways have you had from that one?
So, I'm not just a person in a position of power. I am a woman, and a young woman in a position of power. And that's something that I really noticed it when I was tour manager for Indian Ensembles Muktidham, where we took the show to cities and towns in Uttar Pradesh. And of course, as the tour manager and the stage manager, I'm the one calling the shots. I know what the schedules are. I know where we're living. I know the vendors that we're talking to. I know what equipment is needed at all the venues, except most of the technicians and the volunteers in these towns have never had to deal with a woman in a position of power, right? So they don't like taking instructions from women. They don't know how to respond to an instruction from a woman. So often I would speak to them and I just turn to the male person standing next to me and respond to them. So you have to get the work done. So eventually it was that I ended up speaking through the lighting designer, who was a man, or the director, who was male. And I would give the instruction to them. They would go and tell this person. They would respond back to the director or the lighting designer, and then I would get the information back. And it's not ideal, but in those situations I've had to work that way. But what it has, it's given me more awareness of what things are like. And what it's also done is that I am very conscious of gender ratios in a team, especially now that I work as a producer. I ensure that if the gender ratio in a team is skewed to begin with, then how can I balance it? I'm currently working on a production of The Hound of the Baskervilles, which has 3 male actors and a male director. So I said, okay, how am I going to balance this out? So I'm a female member of the team. I hired then 3 stage managers who were female. So, balancing it out that way. It's not always possible, but it is something that I'm conscious about. And so sometimes, like with Hound, I've been successful where we have an equal number of people. And sometimes it's just not possible, and I'm a single woman in a sea of men.
I'm very aware that you have another meeting to run to.
Yes.
So thank you so much, Sapika, for joining us. I will shuttle it now back to Mark. and kind of take that conversation ahead, maybe, Mark, about how do we, in positions like that, how do you see yourself as an ally? Because, I mean, as someone, I mean, specifically in India, I think I have definitely faced that too, the idea of being a young woman in a profession that is largely dictated by older men. And we also had largely male faculty at RCS for the MACCT program. How do you then position yourself as an ally, especially because in my cohort, we had 4 female directing students?
Well, I'll give you the best answer I can to that question. Before though, in listening to everything you've just said, I just want to say to all the students, I hope that you've gained an appreciation of just how valuable an awesome stage manager is. I get the impression that they are perhaps underappreciated. And I'll tell you right now, it's the biggest mistake you can make is underappreciating a stage manager. If you're making a piece of work, a good stage manager will make or break it. So just want to put that out there because value brilliant stage managers because they are invaluable and they are never out of work. In terms of being an ally in the room, you're right that the core team on CCT was 2 men named Mark, incidentally. But it's worth noting that other Mark was an interim position because the normal other member of the team was on reassignment for the year, and so we do actually have gender balance in the team normally, which I think is important. Now, in terms of being an ally, I think being an ally is about making space. I think fundamentally, if I'm trying to be an ally, it's not about me, and it shouldn't be about me. If I'm in a position of power, and I am both as a head of program and as a director in the room, what I can do is the most effective way I think I can use that power is by getting out of the way. And I think that's one of the most important things that we can do is to just get out of the way and give someone else the center for a little while. With your cohort, Tanvi, and 4 female directors, there are, I need to remember that my experience as a male director, and in terms of because of unconscious or conscious bias, what effect me walking into a rehearsal room has is probably not going to be the same for you. And so my advice has to be tempered with the understanding that I'm operating from a position of tremendous privilege just by virtue of my chromosomes. And that's not right, that's not appropriate, but it means I need to understand that the playing field isn't level. And that's when we're talking about the difference between equality and equity. If we behave like there's a level playing field, then all we're doing is entrenching an existing systematic inequity. It means we have to deal with things in different ways. So what I can't do is I can empathize with, but I cannot actually understand the experience of somebody very different to myself. I can't. I won't have had those experiences. So it becomes about checking my own ego, checking my own sense of self-importance, checking my own sense of I know what I'm doing, to recognize that in a lot of ways I don't. Now, this doesn't speak to directing, but I will offer an example. I recently directed a production where we had a female character or a character whose gender identity was female, and I cast a trans woman in that role. Now, my immediate first question with that actress was to say, do you want to play this character as cis female or trans female? And that is your choice for what you want to do. Now, she ultimately decided that the character would be trans. Now, we weren't changing the text or suddenly making a big deal of it. That was just part of who this character was. Now, at that point, there's an interesting dynamic that's happening in the space. Because if my job as director, in some respect, is to be the first audience member, to look at this and say, how is this landing? What am I understanding? What am I believing? I am in no way equipped to make a determination about her reactions as a trans woman to what characters are saying. So I'm in no way equipped to judge the truthfulness or the validity of some of the subtle performance choices that come by this actress bringing her own identity and her own experience into the room. So what do I do in that situation? Well, it starts with trust. It starts with me just saying, I'm going to trust that you are bringing these experiences into the room, and that there are probably things going on in this scene that I am missing because I don't have the lived experience there. But that there is space for that. So it for me, it's about agency. And it's actually what was already said is the idea of when you're in a position of power, you can use that power to support the agency of others as much as we possibly can. I think that's part of what you do. I think it's also part of asking the question, who's in that room? And how did we get to the situation where these people are in that room? And are we comfortable if somebody who knew nothing about the process looked at this room and saw who was in that room? Are we comfortable with what they would assume about the power dynamics and about everything else just from a view of that room? And if the answer is no, well, then you got to do something. And actually, you have to do something actively, not passively. I'm quite impressed by a writer named Ibram X. Kendi, who's written a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And it's a very simple idea that he puts forward, which is there's no such thing as being not racist. Either you are actively challenging existing racism, in which case you are anti-racist, or you're tacitly endorsing it through inaction at best. Which one do you want to do? And it's a very stark question, but it's a really helpful one because it reminds us that we actually have to take action, that it has to be an active choice, it's not something we're not going to talk about. It's not something we're going to just assume is okay. And actually, Tommy, your year was brilliant in that. And I learned a tremendous amount from working with your cohort because your cohort challenged a lot of things. And I learned quite a lot about that, about these issues from that. And I think that's important too, to recognize that we're all on a journey here and we're all learning together. It's Maya Angelou's quote, do the best you can with what you know, and when you know better, do better. I also want to share a quote because actually I'm conscious again that I am talking about all of these things and I'm taking up space in this conversation. There was an open letter that was published by a collection of Black and global majority colleagues in higher education in drama training in the UK. A wonderful open letter is very much a call to action specifically targeted at white colleagues. Who are the overwhelming majority of people in positions of power in universities in the UK. But they said something I think resonates here, which is this notion of institutional change in institutions. What they said is when responsibility is passed on to an institution, it absolves the responsibility, culpability, and complicity of individuals in perpetuating racist power structures. But it is individuals who make up institutions. And I think that's something that's been touched on, is that yes, the institutional change is necessary, it's important, but individuals make up institutions. And if we wait for institutions to do that work, then we are passing the responsibility on. And again, I think what's important is to remember these things. Thank you. You've posted the link. Thank you very, very much.
I think we have Vidur Sethi who's raised his hand. Could we have you put perhaps your audio and your video on and ask the question?
Yeah, hi. So we were having a discussion with one of our faculty members about not so much of safe space, but just trigger warning. And so he was sharing with us in one of his plays, what ended up happening was that some person in the audience came in and suggested that, you should have put a trigger warning for a car accident. So I wanted to ask you, Mark, that when you speak about performance ethics, what is the space that trigger warnings occupy, and how do you work with these warnings in a protected space?
So I think trigger warnings are tremendously important. I think first of all, it's a basic courtesy. But if we think about what they're for, really it's because if someone is triggered, they're no longer really going to be able to engage with anything else because they're now suddenly dealing with a response. Fundamentally, if I'm making a piece of work, I want people to engage with it. So I am 100% pro trigger warnings, and that's also part of informed consent. Now, we're never going to be perfect with this because there are things we can reasonably assume that we can reasonably assume will trigger someone. You know, like if I'm doing a play again with scenes of sexual violence, I should trigger warning that. It's reasonable to assume that if enough people see it, someone will be triggered by that. But so there may be something that triggers someone that I didn't think of, and that's happened in the room before. And all I can do then is say, "I'm very sorry," and learn from that. But so I think actually, and Tanvi, you'll remember this, I brought in our marketing department for Witch of Edmonton and had them come watch the show and said, "I need to know what we need to tell the audience before they step in the theater." Because I'm not sure how to actually appropriately prepare an audience for what they're going to see. So for me, it's actually a creative decision. A lot of these things, oddly enough, as much as they are best practice, are also the way to get the best results. If your audience knows what they're in for, they've prepared themselves for it, and they're ready to engage with it. If you're surprising them by making them think they were seeing a lighthearted comedy and suddenly it's a deep, deep tragedy, their energy is being spent reorienting themselves to this new reality rather than engaging with the thing you wanted them to engage with in the first place. So you do the best you can. You trigger warn. You think about it and you say, "What do I think might affect someone in this room?" And you offer appropriate warnings for that. They don't need to be massively specific. You know, you can say there are scenes of sexual violence. There are scenes of self-harm. You know, you don't need to go into graphic detail about them, but you can offer at least it's basically giving them a little flag to say, "This is here. If that means you don't want to engage with it, then I'm glad I've kept you safe. But if you do want to engage with it, you've now prepared yourself for it. You know what you're going to engage with, and that means that we're going to get a deeper, more meaningful level of engagement." So I'm all for it.
Thank you. Thanks, Vidur. Tushar, I think, has an observation.
Hey, first of all, thank you, Mark, Tanvi, and Satvika for this conversation. I love this conversation so much. I think I've been having it for the past 5 years, and every time I jump into it, I get something new and exciting to come away with. I'm going to take a deep breath because I have like 10 thoughts going in my brain right now, and I'm going to try and really focus on them one at a time. Satvika mentioned this thing about the rules of the game or rules of engagement, which I think is fantastic. Mostly because power is inherent everywhere. And sometimes when we don't specify the rules of a game, the people engaging in the game are starting at an unfair advantage. So if you know the rules and I don't know the rules, then I am at a disadvantage, and you automatically assume a higher power, uh, what is the word I'm looking for? Level than me. I'm curious because in a lot of the conversation that has been happening so far, we've talked about people in hierarchy in the room, creating the space and creating the rules of engagement. Since I come from an ensemble background and I don't like hierarchy, I'm usually finding myself in a room with equals, whatever that means. And especially as a student, I've found this. My term for best practices has been an ensemble agreement. So the people in the room together kind of come up with the best practices together as a group of individuals. And what the most startling kind of revelation of doing that as a theater student was that we all didn't have the same definition of what consent is. And I'm pretty sure if I asked this group what consent is, we'd all have widely different answers. And especially because I've gone through the Indian education system, no adult ever spoke to me about consent until I was in my third year of theater school in the US. And I found that to be like a major betrayal for me because I had gone through my life thinking, I learned consent through movies and the internet. And then when I had a conversation with my fellows, I was starting to like, shit, I had no idea about enthusiastic consent. These things were foreign to me. And suddenly when as an ensemble, we're talking about consent, cooperation, we're talking about commitment. And now we are finding a shared definition of those things. And now we can engage with the work together because now we're almost on the same footing. So that's my kind of encouragement for y'all students, especially, is when you do find yourselves working in the same place together, uh, kind of find those shared definitions of things. Also, this conversation is super. I mean, in the US, we were talking about anti-racist things, especially the last few months. Recently, I've been having a lot of anti-caste conversations and what that means in the Indian context, what equity means in our Indian context, because even though there are many similarities, we are at a very different place from the UK and the US. So yes, super conversation. Thank you. And I just needed to blurt those things out.
Thank you, Tushar.
I'll say, Tushar, what you just talked about, though, in terms of finding those shared definitions and shared understandings, that is best practice. Best practice isn't a list of do this or do that. It's a process. And the process you've outlined of saying, so what do we understand as a group about what we mean by consent and what we mean by collaboration and what we mean by these things? That's absolutely, that is best practice. What you get out of that will change depending on who you're working with, on who, on what the project is, on everything else. But I would say that's a brilliant takeaway, is actually just the having of that conversation is where best practice starts.
Yeah.
Jahan has asked whether there exist any best practice docs for ensembles from which to adapt or build on every time one starts a new ensemble. Mark, would you have any ideas?
I don't. I mean, again, I think the difficulty, and this was the difficulty with the performance ethics process, is that it's so easy for a document to become a list of do's and don'ts, rather than sort of guidelines for thinking. And I think it's actually, again, it's what Tushar said. It's about having the initial conversation. I think I would almost say what you really want to do is have the conversation, make that agreement with the ensemble, which might be different depending on the ensemble, and then be prepared to revisit that agreement if something's not working. Because inevitably you forget something or you miss something, and then you've got to be willing to go back and say, actually, this has come up now. Can we talk about that? So in a sense, it becomes about having the conversation. But the thing I would also stress, particularly for students, because there is still, unfortunately, a power dynamic when you're in a rehearsal room between the director and actors, for example. There's also a power dynamic between when you're a student versus a teacher. And these things get compounded if you're in drama school, where your teacher is your director and you've got a double power structure happening. What I would honestly say, and this actually comes back to the conversation about, people who have power making space, that's great. But the other part of it is, I tend to think that approach the situation you're in with the right to be there and the right to be heard. And that's very important. I'm a big fan of a philosopher called Martin Buber, who talks about the difference between relations between people, I, it, where I am a subject and it, whoever I'm engaging with, is an object for my benefit, versus what he calls I, thou, where I am a subject and you are a subject and we are meeting together and engaging with each other. I think I, thou is something we lose a lot, or it's lost a lot in the shuffle, and it's so tremendously important. But actually, that's the thing, is that you might not have a director who is making space for a conversation. And I would say, if you can, or I'd say if you feel the need to, start the conversation. If you're doing, if there's a scene with intimacy, say, can we talk about what we want, how we want to handle this intimacy? Now that can be scary because of the power dynamic, and that can feel dangerous. And there's no way around, and there isn't any way around that other than the hope that everybody keeps getting better at this, and you've got to be the one who starts those conversations less and less. But the flip side also becomes remembering that the people in power are just as dependent on the people who feel that they are lower in the hierarchy. So as a director, I'm entirely dependent on actors unless I want to get up there and play all the roles myself, which I absolutely do not. So in that respect, this whole notion of, will this person want to work with me again? Which is often a question actors ask all the world. Am I leaving a good impression? Will they want to work with me again? Will they hire me again? But there's an equally important question. Do you want to work with that person again? And starting that conversation saying, can we talk about how intimacy is going to work? how that person responds in that moment tells you about whether you want to work with them again. Because if they say yes, of course, and they have the conversation and they work through it, then that tells you something about where they are. If they say shut up and get on with it, well, that tells you a bit about who they are and about whether you want to work with them. And that is something that you always have the ability to do, is that whatever else happens, if you're offered work, you can say no. And it's worth remembering that you always have that agency and that no one can force you to do anything.
Thank you. I know we have a bunch of questions, but I'm also aware that we may be out of time.
I can stick, just for what it's worth, Tanvi, I can stick around for a bit longer if it's helpful.
That's amazing. Okay, brilliant. I'm then going to run through some questions. We have one from Shreyan, who is essentially asking, how do you adapt best practice for the digital space in a holistic way, and how does it evolve online?
I wish I knew. We're all coming to grips with digital space, so we're all figuring it out right at the outset. So I think it's important to say that I think best practice is what's going to be made over the coming years as we figure it out. In some ways, I think it's easier because basic things in a rehearsal room that can happen, like people talking over each other, just doesn't work on Zoom because Zoom only lets one microphone be alive at the same time. In some ways, it's trickier because if you're doing digital performance, someone might be editing that performance, which means whoever's editing that performance then has a lot more control over what that work actually says. I made a piece of digital performance recently. It was the first piece of digital work I've ever made, with a couple of actors, where we worked on Zoom but created a recorded piece. And essentially, I tried to keep it as much like a rehearsal process as possible, where there was plenty of space for them to try whatever they wanted to try. In some ways, it was even more freeing because they didn't have to be able to repeat it every night. When it's recorded, they only need to be able to do it once, and we need to get that. So there's much more ability to say, let's try it as many different ways as you want to try it. And then what I did make sure to do, though, is anything like cuts or anything like that, when we were editing, when I edited the piece together, I made sure that those actors saw the first cut. And then we had a long meeting about saying, so this is my first cut. I know it doesn't fully work. Here's the things that I'm still working on. What do you think? Are you happy with this? What do you think this needs? So even though I was then going and doing 40 hours in the editing suite and then sharing it, that piece was not going to be shared with an audience until those actors were happy with it. And until they felt like this was a reflection of what they wanted to do with this piece of work. And I think that's really important. In film, that doesn't exist. The editor and the director get that control. And now, rightly or wrongly, that's where we go. But the great thing about this new alternate reality is that we get to write the rule book. The rules don't exist. There is no tradition. There are no decades of practice. There are no entrenched, powerful people who've been doing this for years who can get away with things. So in a sense, we have to have the conversations in the same way we would in the room, but actually we get to write the rules for it. And that means we're going to get stuff wrong. And we have to be prepared to get things wrong and to realize, okay, we tried to work like that. That didn't work. Things didn't work the way we wanted it to. Let's revisit. But it also means we aren't bound to the bad practice of a previous generation.
We have Satvik, who has his hand up. Satvik, you're up.
Hi, Mark. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yeah, hi. I have a question related to the intimate choreography and the fight choreography. So I wanted to know that how much time does a choreographer actually spends on the script, or if he's there while reading, to understand the character when he's choreographing it, and also how much liberty he or she's been given by the director for the particular scene.
So that will vary depending on the choreographer. What I can tell you in terms of my practice, not an intimacy choreographer, I will know the play very, very well. And I will have a sense of the characters and I will have done my homework on it. I'll also have had a conversation with the director and I've asked what story do you want to tell with this fight? Um, and I'll be clear about that before we go in. Now, at that point, usually what happens with me is I'll go and choreograph something, and when it's choreographed but not locked in, the director will take a look at it and I'll say, and basically we'll say, yes, I'm happy with that. No, I'm not. And we'll adjust accordingly. When I'm choreographing though, I also don't pre-choreograph, because while I may have ideas about the characters, the actors will as well. Um, so for me, it also becomes a conversation of, well, what type of person do you think this character is? And we'll try to build, again, it's trying to build with what's in the room. Now, there are fight directors who spend a lot less time than that, and there are directors who will offer less control or less space for it to be what they want. Often I find directors say, I know the fight needs to end here and the actors are starting here. How they get from point A to point B is up to you, which is nice. But it should be collaborative, because again, I mean, the example I use for fight choreography is good fight choreography works just like good text. It reveals character, it reveals action, it reveals intention, it tells a story. Bad fight choreography is just a bunch of moves. And maybe they look cool, but they're not doing anything. If you want to get a sense of the difference, good fight choreography, the first Matrix movie. Bad fight choreography, all the other Matrix movies. But actually, and if you look at it though, story that's being told in the fight choreography in the first Matrix movie is extraordinary. The detail of it, we know exactly who these people are, and it's revealed by how they actually fight. In the second one, it's just a bunch of bodies flying around in space. But because that's what I think about fight choreography, and intimacy choreography should be the same thing. How does this person behave? You know, simple question. Romeo kisses differently than Paris in Romeo and Juliet. And actually, it's a tremendous opportunity for a director, for actors, and storytelling to actually unpack that and say, if we recognize that, we can reveal something about these characters by that moment, and we can have that conversation, and the actors can feed into that. So I spend a lot of time on it. I also insist on choreographing fights really early in a rehearsal process, usually the first week, with an understanding that there'll be about half an hour spent with all fight choreography being run every day. And then I'll come back in and get it up to speed before dress rehearsals. And then I'll be in again for the dress rehearsals to make sure everything's working with costume and set and everything like that. That's probably more time than other fight directors will spend. But again, I want to do it well, and I want to do it in a way that is collaborative.
Brilliant. Thank you, Satik. Freya, you're next.
Hi, Mark. Because we were having a chat with you and Satvika in this curated conversation, I just got to thinking as to the idea of best practice and how much it has to do with the director leading you into the process, or is it also the combined effort of a stage manager or a production manager coming in together to also find a best solution for this, or is it the director's way of practice that leads you into such a structure?
I think there's a weird sort of either or both answer to that question, because certainly when I'm directing, especially when we get into the theater, I am following the stage manager's lead. The stage manager is in charge when I get in the theater, and I am doing what the stage manager tells me to do. Especially when the stage manager is really good, like Susie was in Witch of Edmonton. Now, the danger of that is that then I am offloading my responsibility. So if I'm saying, the stage manager and the producer are the ones who are going to set best practice, the danger is that I abdicate my responsibility to be a contributor to best practice in the room. It shouldn't be me saying this is how we're going to do things. It should be a conversation. And it should be a conversation with everyone in the room. Now, naturally, because of tradition, people like the producer and the stage manager and the director will be seen as leading that conversation a lot of the time. And that may or may not be right in a particular context. So the trick is for me to say, it's absolutely my responsibility, but I'm not in charge, if that makes sense.
Okay. I also had another question, and that was to do with you speaking about creating work digitally. And I was honestly just trying to understand how the pre-recorded function how the pre-recorded sense of live performances work really on Zoom. How do you go about recording the piece? Do you just record one actor, or do you record them on a phone and put them on a screen through software? I mean, I don't really know.
Well, the piece I did, we didn't use Zoom as a framework. So what I actually did is the actors went and shot material themselves, and I shot material, and then we edited together. And I had an actor in New York, an actor in Glasgow, and myself. So it wasn't actually on Zoom that we worked it. Now, there's a much bigger question there, and I don't think we have time for me to go into this one, but it's a question about liveness and theatricality and what's going on when we watch a play. I'll give you my short answer is that we often think about in theater, well, what is different about theater, right? You know, how is it different than a film? And that's how we justify doing a play instead of a film in terms of as a creative choice. Now, the answer that we almost always come up with is that it's liveness. It's that it's happening right now and live in front of us, right? Now, I don't actually think that's the difference. I actually think the difference is a question of labor. I think that what's actually happening is the audience is being asked to work harder when they see a play than when they watch a film. And so for me, the question for digital performance is not how do we recreate liveness, because actually I've seen plenty of live digital performances on Zoom that didn't feel live at all. The question is, what labor do we give the audience when we can't give them the labor we normally do in the room? So there's my short answer. Theatricality is the labor an audience is being asked to put in. And the question then is about how do you create that? How do you create the demand for that labor or the invitation to undertake that labor?
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's it from the audience. The only question I think I had left in my list was because to just touch on inclusivity and to just very, very briefly talk about using British Sign Language, BSL, and using that alongside and as part of performances and theatre performances is a really, really common practice in Scotland. But you took it one step further with the Witch of Edmonton, where you integrated BSL into the performance and you got a grant to do that. Could you talk us through what that is? Because that is, it seems so sensible and so obvious once you know of the possibilities, but you need to make that journey to understand those possibilities. So could you just talk us through what BSL signing entails and then what you did?
Right. So I should say that a lot of the credit to all of this conversation belongs to a woman called Catherine King, who is one of the best interpreters in Scotland and an expert in this field. So basically, there's a legal context here that's worth knowing, which is the Bsl Scotland Act, which requires organizations to be accessible to to people who are deaf and hard of hearing. So fundamentally, in Scotland now, any organization must be accessible to a deaf audience. And that includes theaters and includes performances. So there's a tradition in the UK of what's called interpreted performance, which involves one or two interpreters. Oddly enough, it's usually one in England and two in Scotland, who will translate the text into BSL and will interpret live on stage for a particular performance so that a deaf audience can come and see the performance and get what's going on. Now, Scotland is at the forefront of how you handle this, because what started immediately was then you had what they call the interpreter light, which is essentially interpreters in all black, so not part of the same costumed world as the performance, at the side of the stage with their own light that had nothing to do with the lighting design, so that deaf audience members could come on that one night, and only that one night, that was the only night it was interpreted, and their experience of watching the performance might be something like this. Looking back and forth to the interpreter to get the language, and then back at the actors to see the performance, which isn't really that effective. Now, from what I know from Catherine, is the deaf audiences have said, we don't like that. We want something more interesting. So in Scotland, that's generally not how things work. The interpreter is meant to be in some way integrated into the performance, that essentially you don't have that bouncing back and forth effect. The National Theatre of Scotland actually requires that to happen in all of its directing contracts. So if you're directing for the National Theatre of Scotland, you are contractually obligated to embed performance, to embed interpretation, not at the side of the stage in a special light, but within the world. And the budget for that is also not part of the access budget, but part of the creative budget for the production. So there's some basic things they've done to essentially make it integral. What Catherine and I did is took that even a step further, because what normally happens, even in that world, is the interpreter will come in for a dress rehearsal. They'll get at most a 3-hour run of the show where they have to block themselves within the show, figure out where they're going to stand, figure out everything they're going to do, effectively play every character, and then they get up in front of an audience and they do it on one rehearsal of 3 hours. If that, sometimes they just get to watch a dress rehearsal and then they get up and do it without ever having done it before. So you can imagine that doesn't necessarily always lead to the best work. What Catherine and I did instead is we looked at it and we said, number one, do we like the idea of one performance being the performance where a deaf audience can see it? There's a segregation there that comes into play. Now it comes into play because interpreters are expensive. And so companies can't always afford to have an interpreter for every performance. But because Catherine and I were working and we got a grant, we decided at the outset that every performance would be interpreted. Which means that just like a hearing audience member, a deaf audience member can come to whatever performance they want. There is no restriction in that way. Now, once you make that leap, though, it becomes that, okay, so now I suddenly have 2 extra bodies in the space. There are 2 more people in the space. And as a director, I'm naturally thinking, now, what does that mean creatively? What are the dramaturgical possibilities? What can we do with 2 more bodies? 2 bodies who are particularly sort of in this world, but not of this world. There's sort of a bridge between audience and performance. And at that point, we suddenly then have a huge wealth of creative possibilities that open up, where suddenly you have interpreters who might do something, who might contribute in some way to not just a better experience for a deaf audience, because they're actually be able to watch the performance as they go, but for a hearing audience as well. And particularly for Elizabethan and Jacobean text, which is what we've worked on. One of the bits of feedback we get quite a lot is actually the audience understands the play better, because if they're not sure what the actors are saying, they can watch the BSL and the BSL helps them make more sense of it, even if they don't speak BSL. So again, the journey was from, we want this to be accessible because, I want my work to be seen by as many people as can. And if there's a group of people who can't see it, maybe I should do something about that. That's where it starts. And then it becomes, if I'm doing something about that, what's the most creatively interesting way how can I get the most value out of that? So we played with things, for example, like oftentimes in interpreted performance, the deaf audience is about 2 seconds behind because the interpreter doesn't memorize the performance. They learn it and then they hear it and they interpret it. Which means, for example, if you've got a joke, the deaf audience will get the joke 2 seconds after a hearing audience gets the joke because the interpreter is behind. But because Catherine was involved the whole time and not just for 3 hours at the end, we could actually set the interpretation where sometimes the deaf audience got the joke first and the interpretation was 2 seconds ahead. So a deaf audience would realize something first and then the hearing audience would catch up to them after, which is, again, really a question of equity and a question of status. If the deaf audience is always 2 seconds behind, the BSL is implicitly of inferior status. If we're more fluid with that, or if there are jokes, for example, that only the BSL using audience can get, and there were things in the performance that only a BSL using audience would understand, suddenly we don't have the same experience anymore. And that's, again, the difference between equality and equity. I don't think the deaf audience gets the same experience as a hearing audience, but I think they have parity of experience. They get something that is as rich and as exciting, hopefully, even if it's not the same. And rather than trying to make it the same, we try to make it as good.
Thank you. I think that's it from me. I'll have Ira close, but thank you so much, Mark. It was incredible to have you here. I don't think I've heard such a conversation happening sitting in Bombay. And I think I loved reliving a lot of my master's year with you and a lot of the learnings that I took away from your mentorship in your rooms. And I really hope this has been useful. And I thank you and Satika and of course everybody here who came along. Thank you so much.
Can I say one more thing that I just want to offer?
Yes.
And I think it's important because what we're talking about here is a process. And it's a process of trying to be better and do better. It always will be. And by nature of this conversation, I'm talking a lot, and I'm talking a lot about things that I feel that I know. But actually, what's important are the moments when we realize we don't know everything. So this is just, again, as an encouragement, because the challenge coming out of a conversation like this is for each of you to have more conversations and to do more discussion. And that can sometimes be difficult. So what I want to share with you with is actually a very quick story about a time recently when I got the conversation so painfully wrong, and then what I did about it, because I think that's an important thing too. So a group of students raised the issue of diversity, inclusion, anti-racism, all of these things, particularly because on the program that I run, we have people from all over the world who are coming from different experiences, different cultural contexts, so different things. So there are things that might be okay to say in their home culture that are not considered racist or problematic, but are problematic to someone else from a different culture. And those issues come up in the program every year, that clash of cultures and finding that shared understanding. So it came up and it brought up, and I thought that I handled that conversation so well. I was patting myself on the back. I was like, "Yep, I'm so woke. I am totally up for this," and everything like that. Because what I said, I'm going to guess that most of you are going to realize where I went wrong as I repeat what I said to this group of students. But for those who don't, I will then tell you where I went wrong. I said, we need to start from the idea that everybody wants to do the best they can, and that everybody is in this room with good intentions. And that if something happens that is problematic, it's everybody's responsibility to say so and to address it. But we need to give people the benefit of the doubt that that is unintentional, and give them the benefit of the doubt until they prove they aren't worthy of the benefit of the doubt. And I thought, okay, we're going to talk about everything, and some of you have a look on your face like, man, you really got it wrong there. And I absolutely did. And it took me a while to realize I did because no one actually called me out on it. And what I realized is that in saying that, I did the thing I talked about at the beginning. The burden for making the space work suddenly fell on the people who were being hurt by inadvertent or deliberate action, rather than on the people who were perpetrating that. In a sense, I privileged the intention of the people who were doing things over the effect that they had, which is ludicrous if you think about it. If I step on someone's toe and it hurts them, even if I didn't mean to, I'm still going to apologize, and I still stepped on their toe, and their toe doesn't hurt any less because I didn't mean to do it. And I realized this, and I had to go back and apologize to that group of students. And I actually did apologize to that group of students because I felt like I'd let them down, particularly those people who were the ones who were dealing with the inadvertent comment or things like that, because suddenly they felt like it was their responsibility to just shut up and get on with it because no one really meant it. So again, I'm sharing with you that not because I now know better, and the conversation now would be effect matters, not intention. So watch what you say. Don't give people the benefit of the doubt. Watch what you say and be aware of each other. But also to say that's the process that we ought to go on. And I only know that now because I got it wrong the first time. Interestingly, when I did apologize, many of the Black and global majority students in that room were brave enough to say to me, when we had that conversation, I felt less safe as a result of what you said. And I feel better knowing that you've now owned up to that. Now I've got to live with the fact that I got that wrong and that those students felt less safe for the period of time between when I got it wrong and the period of time where I tried to make it right. But that's part of what we're talking about. So have the conversations. Know that you will almost certainly get it wrong at some point when you're having those conversations. We all will. When you get it wrong, don't pat yourself on the back for trying your best. Own the fact that you got it wrong and then do better next time.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you so much. Thank you, Tanvi. Thank you, Satvika. I think that was such a wonderful conversation and so important. And I am just so glad that it's happening at this stage for this bunch of students because they're just starting out. I think for too long we have wrongly believed that the ends justify the means, and if you create a great piece of work, then how you did it and how miserable you were doing it doesn't really matter. But that is so wrong. uh, you guys are the ones who are not only going to shape theater to come, you're also going to shape rehearsal rooms. So, how theater is made, how we treat each other in those spaces is as important as what you make. And I think this is a great step in that direction, in the direction of having these conversations and being aware and sensitive, and making sure that your rehearsal spaces are happier, fairer, more protected spaces than ever before. So thank you. Thank you once again. That was a great evening. Thanks everyone. And we'll meet again for the next curated conversation next month. I mean, sorry, next unit. But just something that everybody should keep in mind, that the next unit onwards, these conversations are going to be on the 5th Tuesday and not the 5th Thursday. You all of this will be communicated, but I just thought I should mention this so that you know. Again, thank you so much, Mark. I cannot thank you enough for this. Yeah.
It's my pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming.